The scream tore through the frozen woods before Alexander even saw her. He pulled his horse to a hard stop, snow flying from its hooves, and listened. There it was again, a broken, gasping cry coming from somewhere near the frozen stream at the edge of his land. He swung down from the saddle and ran, boots sinking into snow that had fallen thick and fast since noon. He found her curled against the roots of an old oak, her thin cloak soaked through, her lips turning blue. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. Blood had dried in a thin line above her brow, and her hands were curled into fists so tight her knuckles had gone white. Alexander dropped to his knees beside her. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "Can you hear me?" She flinched at his voice, as if waking from a nightmare into another one. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, barely audible, she spoke a single word. "Please." He did not wait for more. He gathered her into his arms, feeling how light she was, how her body shook with cold and something deeper than cold. She weighed almost nothing, as though she had not eaten properly in days. He carried her to his horse and mounted with her held against his chest, urging the animal into a careful trot through the darkening woods toward Ashmere Hall. The great house rose out of the snow like a fortress, its windows glowing gold against the blue evening. A footman ran out at the sound of hooves, and by the time Alexander reached the front steps, the housekeeper, Mrs. Ellery, was already calling for blankets and hot water. "Who is she, Your Grace?" Mrs. Ellery asked, her eyes wide with alarm as she took in the woman's condition. "I do not know," Alexander said. "I found her in the snow near the old stream. Get a fire going in the blue room, and send for the physician." They carried the young woman inside, her body limp now, exhaustion finally claiming her. Alexander stood in the hallway, snow melting from his coat, watching as the servants hurried up the staircase with her. Something about the moment unsettled him in a way he could not name. It was not simply the shock of finding a stranger freezing in his woods. It was the look in her eyes before she fainted, the terror that went far deeper than cold and hunger. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time and reached the blue room just as the physician arrived. Dr. Bellamy was an older man, calm and steady, and he set to work at once, checking her pulse, her breathing, the wound above her brow. "She has been out in the cold for hours," Bellamy said. "Perhaps longer. Whoever did this to her head did not do it gently." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Did this to her. This is not a fall, Your Grace," Bellamy said, examining the wound more closely. "Someone struck her." The words settled over Alexander like a stone dropping into still water. He looked at the young woman on the bed, her chestnut hair spread across the pillow, her face pale but no longer as blue as it had been. Whoever she was, someone had hurt her and left her to die in the snow. "Will she live?" Alexander asked. "I believe so, if the fever does not take her," Bellamy said. "She needs warmth, rest, and time." Alexander stayed in the room long after the physician had gone, sitting in a chair near the fire, watching the rise and fall of the stranger's chest. He told himself he stayed only out of concern for a woman he had rescued, nothing more. But some part of him, some old and guarded part, recognized the fear on her face as something he understood far too well. Hours passed. The fire crackled low, and outside the window the snow kept falling, silent and endless. Mrs. Ellery came twice to check on the patient, and twice found the Duke still sitting there, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the woman's face as though he expected her to vanish if he looked away. "Your Grace, you should rest," Mrs. Ellery said gently on her second visit. "I will sit with her." "I am not tired," Alexander said, though the shadows beneath his eyes told a different story. It was near midnight when the woman began to stir. Her brow furrowed, her lips parted, and a soft sound escaped her throat, somewhere between a moan and a word. Alexander leaned forward, watching closely. Her eyes opened, glassy with fever, and for a moment she seemed to look right through him, as though she were seeing someone else entirely, someone from long ago. Her hand reached out, trembling, grasping at the air. "Edmund," she whispered. The name struck Alexander like a physical blow. He went utterly still, his breath caught in his chest, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. It had been 5 years since he had heard that name spoken aloud in his own house. 5 years since his younger brother had been carried home from the lake, pale and lifeless, and the household had fallen into a silence that had never truly lifted. No one spoke that name at Ashmere Hall, not the servants, not his mother, before she passed the following winter, her heart broken beyond mending. Not Alexander himself, who had spent 5 years burying the questions that still haunted him about how his brother had died on a calm summer evening in water he had swum in 100 times before. And now this stranger, this woman he had never met, had spoken it as though it belonged to her. Alexander rose from his chair and moved closer to the bed, his hands gripping the edge of the mattress. "Who are you?" he said, his voice low and urgent. "How do you know that name?" But she had slipped back into unconsciousness, her hand falling limp against the blankets, her breathing slow and shallow once more. Alexander stood over her, his mind racing through 100 impossible questions. Had she known Edmund? Had she been there? That evening at the lake, when everything had gone wrong? Was the wound on her head connected somehow to the past he had spent 5 years trying to bury? He did not sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the fire, staring at the stranger's face, searching it for some clue, some resemblance, some answer. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with a face that might have been pretty if it were not so drawn with exhaustion and fear. Her hands, when he studied them in the firelight, were rough in places, the hands of someone who had worked hard for her living, not a lady of leisure then, perhaps a governess, or a lady's companion, someone who had fallen on difficult times. But none of that explained the name. By dawn, the fever had broken slightly, and her breathing had steadied. Alexander finally allowed himself to be persuaded from the room by Mrs. Ellery, who insisted he eat something and rest for even an hour. He agreed only because he knew a maid would be posted at the woman's door, with strict instructions to fetch him the moment she woke. He went to his study instead of his bedchamber, unable to face the idea of sleep. He sat at his desk, staring at the portrait of his brother that hung above the mantel. Edmund's easy smile frozen forever at 19 years old. Alexander had looked at that portrait 1,000 times over 5 years, asking the same unanswered questions. But tonight, for the first time since the funeral, he felt something shift inside him, a crack in the wall he had built around his grief. Someone out there knew something about Edmund's death, and she was sleeping in his blue room, 1 floor above him, with no memory yet of what she had said. Alexander pressed his palms against his eyes and let out a long breath. He had spent 5 years convincing himself that his brother's death was an accident, that there was nothing more to learn, no comfort to be found in digging deeper into a tragedy that could not be undone. He had told himself that grief needed to be buried, not chased. But now a stranger had appeared out of a snowstorm, wounded and terrified, whispering a name that no one outside his family should have known to speak. And Alexander understood, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in his chest, that whatever had happened 5 years ago at the lake was not as finished as he had believed. He would have answers. He would find out who this woman was, how she knew his brother's name, and who had struck her and left her to freeze in his woods. Whatever the truth was, he intended to have it, no matter what it cost him. The first gray light of morning crept through the study windows, and Alexander finally rose from his desk, his body stiff from the long night. He walked to the window and looked out over the grounds, where the snow had stopped falling and now lay in smooth, unbroken drifts across the lawn. Somewhere beneath that snow, near the old oak by the stream, he had found her. He wondered how long she had been lying there before her cries reached him, and whether anyone else had heard her and simply walked away. A soft knock came at the study door. It was one of the younger maids, Hannah, her face flushed from hurrying through the corridors. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying quickly. "The lady has woken. She is asking where she is." Alexander was on his feet before Hannah finished speaking. He climbed the stairs swiftly, his exhaustion forgotten, and reached the blue room to find the stranger sitting up against the pillows, blinking in confusion at her unfamiliar surroundings. Her chestnut hair had dried into loose waves, and though her face was still pale, there was color returning to her cheeks. Her eyes, when they found his, were a clear, striking gray, and they widened with alarm as he stepped through the doorway. "Who are you?" she asked, pulling the blankets closer as though they might shield her. "Where am I?" "You are safe," Alexander said, keeping his voice calm despite the storm of questions inside him. "This is Ashmere Hall. I found you in the snow last night, near the stream at the edge of my land." She studied him carefully, her gaze sharp despite her weakened state, as though she were trying to decide whether to trust him. "I do not remember," she said slowly. "I remember the cold. I remember falling. After that, nothing." Alexander watched her closely, searching her face for any sign that she was lying. "Do you remember your name?" he asked. "Charlotte," she said after a pause. "Charlotte Ashby." "And do you remember anything else?" Alexander pressed gently. "Anything you might have said last night, before you woke?" Confusion flickered across her features. "I do not understand. What did I say?" He hesitated, unwilling to reveal too much too soon. "It was a name," he said finally. "You spoke a name in your sleep." Charlotte's brow furrowed, and for a moment something like fear passed behind her eyes, quickly hidden away. "I could not tell you, Your Grace," she said. "I have no memory of speaking at all." Alexander did not believe her, not entirely, but he saw the exhaustion still weighing on her, the tremor in her hands as she adjusted the blankets, and he decided the questions could wait a little longer. "You should rest," he said. "We will speak again once you have regained your strength." He left the room with more questions than he had entered with, but one thing had become clear to him in those few minutes. Whoever Charlotte Ashby was, and whatever had brought her to his woods bleeding and half frozen, she was hiding something. And he intended to uncover every piece of it, no matter how long it took, no matter what secret stood between her arrival and the truth about his brother. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and steady, as if the world itself were waiting to see what would happen next. 3 days after the snowstorm, Charlotte Ashby was still at Ashmere Hall, and she still had not told Alexander the truth. He watched her now from across the drawing room, seated near the fire with a cup of tea she had barely touched. Color had returned fully to her face, and the wound above her brow had begun to heal into a thin pink line. She looked, at first glance, like any well-mannered young woman enjoying the warmth of a winter afternoon. But Alexander had spent enough years reading people, in ballrooms and in business, to see the tension coiled beneath her calm exterior. She flinched at sudden sounds. She watched the door more than she watched him. "You have not told me how you came to be in my woods," Alexander said, setting down his own cup. Charlotte's hands tightened slightly around hers. "I was traveling," she said. "I lost my position as a governess, and I was walking toward the village when the storm caught me. I must have lost my way." "Walking," Alexander repeated. "In that storm. Alone. With no coat sufficient for the cold, and a wound on your head that my physician says was not caused by any fall." Charlotte's eyes flicked up to his, sharp and wary. "Are you accusing me of lying, Your Grace?" "I am asking you to stop," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I do not know what happened to you, Miss Ashby, but I know a fabricated story when I hear one. And I know that you said a name in this house that has not been spoken here in 5 years." She went very still. "What name?" she asked, though something in her voice told him she already knew the answer. "Edmund," Alexander said. "My brother. He died 5 years ago, and no one outside my family has any reason to know that name, let alone speak it in a fever dream." Charlotte set down her tea with a trembling hand. "I am sorry," she said. "I do not know why I would have said such a thing. I have never met your brother, Your Grace." Alexander leaned forward, studying her face with an intensity that made her look away. He had spent 5 years wanting nothing more than someone who could tell him something new about that terrible summer evening, and now fate, or something like it, had delivered a stranger to his door who knew the one name that should have meant nothing to her. "I do not believe you," he said simply. Charlotte rose from her chair, agitation replacing her earlier calm. "Then believe what you wish," she said. "I have told you what I know. I lost my position, I was traveling, and I was caught in the storm. If you do not trust my word, perhaps I should leave." "And go where?" Alexander asked, rising as well. "Into the snow again, with no coat and no coin, so that whoever struck you can finish what they started." The words landed like a slap. Charlotte's composure cracked for just a moment, her eyes widening before she caught herself and looked away toward the window. Alexander saw it, the flash of raw fear before the mask returned, and he knew he had struck close to something true. "You know who did this to you?" he said, softer now. "Don't you?" Charlotte did not answer. She stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the endless white grounds as though searching for an escape route that did not exist. "I cannot tell you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is not safe. Not for me, and not for anyone who tries to help me." Alexander crossed the room and stood beside her, close enough to see the tremor still in her hands. "I am the Duke of Ashmere," he said. "There are very few things in this county I cannot protect you from." Charlotte turned to look at him then, and something in her gaze, a mixture of gratitude and desperate hope and lingering fear, struck him harder than he expected. "You do not know what you are offering," she said. "You do not know what you would be protecting me from." "Then tell me," Alexander said. For a long moment, she seemed on the verge of speaking. Her lips parted, her eyes searched his face, as though weighing whether he could be trusted with whatever burden she carried. But then the moment passed, and she shook her head, stepping back from him. "Not yet," she said. "Please, give me time." Alexander wanted to press further, but something in her expression, the exhaustion and fear layered beneath her stubborn composure, made him relent. "Very well," he said. But you will stay here, under my protection, until you are ready to tell me the truth. I will not have you wandering into another storm, or into worse danger, while there are answers you are keeping from me." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine his motives. "Why does it matter so much to you?" she asked. "A stranger's secrets. Why not simply send me on my way and forget you ever found me?" "Because you spoke my brother's name," Alexander said, "and because I have spent 5 years believing his death was an accident that no one could explain. If there is even a chance you know something, I cannot simply let you disappear back into the snow." Something shifted in Charlotte's expression, a flicker of guilt that she quickly hid. "I understand," she said quietly. Over the following days, an uneasy routine settled over the household. Charlotte remained in the blue room, though she was permitted to walk in the gardens under a servant's watchful eye, and to take her meals with Alexander in the small dining room rather than alone. The staff whispered among themselves about the mysterious young woman the Duke had rescued, and about the strange tension that seemed to hum in the air whenever the two of them were in a room together. Mrs. Ellery, who had served the Whitmore family for over 20 years, watched the arrangement with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "She is hiding something, Your Grace," the housekeeper said one evening, as she helped arrange fresh flowers in the drawing room. "Any fool can see it. But I have also seen the way she looks at you when she believes no one is watching. There is more sorrow in that girl than secrets, if you ask me." Alexander said nothing, but he had noticed it too. There were moments, brief and unguarded, when Charlotte's careful composure slipped, and he glimpsed something raw beneath it, grief perhaps, or regret, twisted together with fear so deep it seemed to have taken root in her very bones. One evening, nearly a week after the storm, Alexander found her in the library long after the rest of the household had retired. She sat curled in a window seat, a single candle burning beside her, staring at nothing in particular. She startled when he entered, quickly wiping at her eyes. "I did not mean to disturb you," he said, though he made no move to leave. "You are not disturbing me," Charlotte said, though her voice was thick. "I could not sleep." Alexander crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest the window seat, close enough to speak quietly but far enough to give her space. "Neither of us has slept well since the storm," he said. "Perhaps we are both haunted by the same unanswered questions." Charlotte gave a small, humorless laugh. "Perhaps," she agreed. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling low in the hearth, snow ticking softly against the window panes. Alexander found himself studying her profile in the candlelight, the delicate line of her jaw, the shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of exhaustion far deeper than a few sleepless nights could cause. "Tell me one true thing," he said finally, "not the whole story. Just one true thing, so that I know I am not entirely a fool for trusting you." Charlotte turned to look at him, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Then, quietly, she spoke. "I knew your brother," she said. "Not well, but I knew him." Alexander's heart clenched at the confirmation, even though he had suspected it from the very first night. "How?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears she did not let fall. "I cannot tell you more tonight," she said. "But I promise you, Your Grace, I will, when I am certain it is safe to do so." Alexander wanted to demand more, to shake the whole truth free from her before she could retreat behind her careful walls again. But he saw the fragile trust in her eyes, trust she had never intended to offer a stranger, and he understood that pushing too hard now might shatter it entirely. "Then I will wait," he said. "But not forever, Charlotte." She nodded, and for the first time since he had found her in the snow, something like relief passed across her face. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the grounds of Ashmere Hall in silence, while inside its walls, two people bound together by grief and secrets sat close in the candlelight, each wondering how much longer the truth could stay buried. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. Alexander was in his study reviewing accounts when Hollis, his butler, announced the arrival of Mr. Gerald Whitmore, the Duke's cousin and closest living male relative aside from Alexander himself. Gerald swept into the study with his usual easy charm, his coat still dusted with snow from the journey. "Cousin," Gerald said, settling into the chair across from the desk without waiting to be invited. "I heard the strangest rumor in the village. Something about you rescuing a mysterious young woman from the storm. The whole county is talking of nothing else." Alexander kept his expression carefully neutral. "She was injured and in danger of freezing to death. I did what any decent man would do." Of course," Gerald said, though his eyes glittered with curiosity. "And who is she?" "Exactly. A relation. A friend of the family. A former governess, caught in the storm while traveling," Alexander said, giving the same explanation Charlotte had offered, though he no longer believed it himself. She is recovering here until she is well enough to continue on her way. Gerald's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened, a flicker of interest that Alexander did not care for. "How very charitable of you," Gerald said, "though I confess I am surprised. You have never been one for taking in strays, cousin." "Not since Edmund." The mention of his brother's name from Gerald's mouth sent a familiar irritation through Alexander, though he kept it carefully hidden. "Is there a purpose to your visit, Gerald, or did you simply come to gossip about my household?" Gerald spread his hands in a gesture of mock innocence. "Can a man not visit his own family without suspicion?" he said. "Though I admit, I did hope to catch a glimpse of your mysterious guest. The village has already given her quite a reputation. Some say she is a runaway bride. Others say she is hiding from a scandal in London." "She is neither," Alexander said flatly, "and I would ask that you not encourage such talk. She has been through enough without becoming fodder for gossip." Gerald raised his hands in surrender, though his smile remained fixed in place. "As you wish, cousin. I only worry about you. A duke's reputation is a fragile thing, and a stranger appearing from nowhere, wounded and full of secrets, is bound to raise questions. Questions about her character, and questions about yours." After Gerald departed, Alexander sat for a long while at his desk, unable to shake the unease his cousin's visit had left behind. There had always been something in Gerald's manner that unsettled him, a hunger beneath the polished charm, though Alexander had never been able to name exactly what it was. Gerald stood only a few steps from the title and the estate, should anything happen to Alexander himself, a fact that had never troubled him before Edmund's death, but which lingered now like a shadow at the edge of his thoughts. That afternoon, Alexander found Charlotte in the garden, walking slowly along the cleared path with a maid trailing a discreet distance behind her. She looked better than she had in days, her cheeks touched with color from the cold air, though her eyes still carried that same watchful wariness. "My cousin visited today," Alexander said, falling into step beside her. "Gerald Whitmore. Have you ever heard his name before?" Charlotte's steps faltered, just slightly, before she recovered her pace. "No," she said. "Should I have?" Alexander studied her carefully, uncertain whether her hesitation meant something or nothing at all. "I only wondered," he said. "He seemed unusually interested in you, for a man who has never met you." Charlotte wrapped her arms around herself, though the gesture seemed to have little to do with the cold. "Word travels quickly in the countryside," she said. "I imagine any stranger would draw curiosity." "Perhaps," Alexander said, though he was not entirely convinced. But he let the matter rest, unwilling to press her further while so much remained unspoken between them. They walked the rest of the garden path in silence, the winter sun low and pale above the frozen hedgerows, each of them carrying questions they were not yet ready to voice aloud. That night, long after the household had gone quiet, Charlotte lay awake in the blue room, staring at the shadows the dying fire cast across the ceiling. She thought of Gerald Whitmore's name, and though she had told Alexander the truth when she said she had never met the man, the name itself was not entirely unfamiliar. She had heard it once before, spoken in a hushed and frightened voice, in a house far from Ashmere Hall, on a night she had spent 5 years trying to forget. She pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle a sound that was half sob, half gasp, and told herself she would say nothing yet. Not until she understood how deep the danger truly ran, and whether the man who had rescued her from the snow could be trusted with a truth that might cost them both everything. The candle in the study had burned down to a stub by the time Alexander found Charlotte standing over his desk, papers scattered across its surface, her fingers frozen mid-motion over a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharp enough to make her flinch. Charlotte spun to face him, guilt written plainly across her face. "I could not sleep," she said. "I came looking for a book, and I saw the letters, and I only meant to look." "Those are my brother's letters," Alexander said, crossing the room in a few quick strides. "Private correspondence. What exactly were you hoping to find in them?" Charlotte's composure cracked entirely then, tears springing to her eyes as she backed away from the desk. "I was not trying to steal anything," she said. "I swear it. I only wanted to know more about him. About Edmund. I thought perhaps his letters might help me remember." "Remember what?" Alexander demanded. "Enough games, Charlotte. You have danced around the truth for over a week, and I have let you, out of some misguided sense of patience I no longer have. Tell me now. How did you know my brother, and what happened to you before I found you in the snow?" Charlotte sank into the chair beside the desk, her hands trembling in her lap. For a long moment she said nothing, and Alexander thought she might retreat behind her walls once more. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. 5 years ago, I worked as a lady's companion in a household near the coast, she said. The Pemberton family. I was young, only 17, and grateful for the position, since my own family had little money to spare. One evening, a young gentleman came to visit the household. He was kind to me, in a way few gentlemen were kind to a companion. We spoke several times over the course of his stay. He told me his name was Edmund. Alexander's chest tightened. Edmund never mentioned the Pembertons, he said. Not once, in all the years I knew him. Perhaps he did not wish to, Charlotte said softly, because of what happened during his visit. Tell me, Alexander said, sitting down slowly across from her. Charlotte drew a shaking breath. There was another guest in the house that week, she said, a man named Gerald. I did not know then that he was your cousin. I only knew that he did not like Edmund, and that the two of them argued bitterly on the final night of the visit, over money, I believe, though I never learned the particulars. I was passing the drawing room when I heard raised voices, and then I heard Gerald say something I have never forgotten. He said that Edmund would regret crossing him, that he would make certain of it. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. Edmund drowned 3 weeks after that visit, he said. In the lake behind our own estate, on a calm summer evening, in water he had swum in his entire life. Charlotte nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I did not know that at the time, she said. I left the Pemberton household shortly after, when my position ended, and I heard nothing more of Edmund Whitmore until months later, when a newspaper mentioned his death as a tragic accident. I told myself it could not be connected. I told myself I was imagining danger where there was none. But I never forgot what I heard that night, and I never forgot the name Gerald. Why did you not come forward? Alexander asked, his voice tight with a grief and anger he had carried for 5 long years. Why did you not tell someone what you heard? Charlotte's face crumpled with old shame. Because 3 days after I left the Pemberton household, a man came to my lodgings, she said. He did not give his name, but he made it very clear that I was to say nothing of what I had heard that night, to anyone, ever, or I would meet a fate far worse than dismissal. I was 17, alone, with no family to protect me and no money to run far enough to feel safe. I did as I was told. I have spent 5 years trying to forget that night ever happened. Then why come forward now? Alexander asked. Why speak my brother's name at all, if you had buried it so deep? Charlotte wiped at her eyes, steadying herself before she answered. Because the man who threatened me found me again, she said, 2 weeks ago. I was working as a governess in a household not far from here, and he appeared at my door one evening, reminding me that his warning still stood. I do not know how he knew where to find me, but I panicked. I fled that same night, taking only what I could carry, and I ran without any real plan. Only the desperate hope of putting distance between myself and him. I do not know exactly how I ended up near your land. I only remember running, and falling, and the cold closing in around me. Alexander sat in stunned silence, the pieces of 5 years of unanswered grief rearranging themselves into a shape he had never dared imagine. Did you see his face? He asked. The man who threatened you. Only once, briefly, in poor light, Charlotte said. I would not recognize him again with certainty. But I remember his voice, and I remember that he mentioned Gerald's name once, carelessly, as though he assumed I already knew who had sent him. Gerald, Alexander repeated, the name tasting bitter in his mouth. My own cousin. I cannot prove it was him who ordered Edmund's death, Charlotte said quickly. I only know what I overheard, and what I was threatened into forgetting. It may mean nothing at all. But Alexander was already standing, pacing the length of the study, his mind racing through years of small suspicions he had never allowed himself to examine too closely. Gerald had always been the first to console him after Edmund's death, always eager to offer comfort and support, always positioning himself closer to the family's affairs than any cousin needed to be. Gerald stood to inherit everything, should Alexander die without an heir, a fact that had never troubled him before tonight, but which now settled over him like a physical weight. He visited today, Alexander said, half to himself. He asked about you. He seemed almost too curious about a stranger he had never met. Charlotte's face paled further. Then he may already suspect I am here, she said. If the man who threatened me reports to Gerald, he may already know where I have gone. Alexander stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression hard with new resolve. Then we must be careful, he said. You will not leave the grounds of this estate without an escort. I will speak to my staff and ensure the household is watched more closely. And I will begin quietly looking into Gerald's affairs from that summer, to see what I can learn. Charlotte rose from her chair, closing the distance between them until she stood only a few steps away. Alexander, she said, her voice trembling, if I am right, if Gerald truly is responsible for what happened to your brother, then bringing this into the light could be dangerous for both of us. He has had 5 years to cover his tracks, and considerable resources to do so. I have spent 5 years living beside my brother's killer without knowing it, Alexander said, his voice low and fierce. I will not spend a 6th year in ignorance, whatever the cost. Charlotte reached out, her fingers brushing his sleeve in a gesture that was almost involuntary, born of shared grief rather than calculation. I am sorry, she whispered. I should have found the courage to speak sooner. Perhaps if I had, none of this would have happened. Perhaps you would have had answers years ago. Alexander covered her hand with his own, the gesture surprising them both. You were 17 and alone, he said. You did what you had to do to survive. I do not fault you for that, Charlotte. I only wish you had trusted me sooner, so that we might have had more time to prepare for whatever comes next. They stood close together in the dim study. The fire burned down to embers, the weight of 5 years of buried grief and fear settling between them like something almost physical. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with everything that had finally been said, and everything that still remained unknown. I will not let him hurt you, Alexander said finally. Whatever Gerald has done, whatever he intends, you are under my protection now, and I do not make that promise lightly. Charlotte looked up at him, something fragile and hopeful flickering behind the fear still lingering in her eyes. Thank you, she said softly, for believing me. I was so certain you would think me mad, or worse, that you would think I had invented the story for some purpose of my own. I believe you, Alexander said. Every word. The fire crackled softly in the hearth as the last of its embers settled, and outside the window the snow had finally stopped falling, leaving the grounds of Ashmere Hall wrapped in silent, unbroken white. Alexander walked Charlotte to the door of the study, and for a moment, standing in the threshold, something passed between them that neither dared to name, a fragile thread of trust, and something warmer, beginning to take root beneath the fear and grief they now shared. Get some rest, Alexander said. Tomorrow we begin looking for the truth in earnest. Charlotte nodded, though she lingered a moment longer than necessary before finally turning toward the stairs. Alexander watched her go, his mind already turning over the beginnings of a plan, half-formed and dangerous, to uncover what his cousin had done, and to ensure that whatever Gerald had set in motion 5 years ago would finally, after so long, be brought into the light. He returned to his desk and sat staring at the bundle of his brother's letters, still scattered where Charlotte had left them. He gathered them carefully, retying the faded ribbon, and for the first time in 5 years, he allowed himself to read through them slowly, searching now not for comfort, but for any small clue his brother might have left behind, any mention of the Pembertons, of that final visit, of whatever had truly happened between Edmund and their cousin in the weeks before his death. He found nothing conclusive that night, but he found something else, a renewed sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since the day Edmund's body had been carried home from the lake. Grief, he realized, had kept him frozen for 5 long years, unwilling to ask the hard questions, because he feared what the answers might cost him. But now, with Charlotte's testimony ringing in his ears and his cousin's name hanging over the study like a shadow, Alexander understood that he could no longer afford the luxury of not knowing. Whatever it cost him, he would find the truth, and he would see justice done for his brother at last. The next morning, Alexander summoned Hollis to the study before the household had fully woken. The butler had served the Whitmore family since Alexander was a boy, and there were few secrets at Ashmere Hall that escaped his notice. I need you to do something for me, Alexander said, and I need it done quietly. I want to know everything you can learn about my cousin Gerald's finances over the past 5 years. His debts, his income, any unusual sums that have passed through his hands. I also want to know whether he has ever employed a man for tasks he would not wish spoken of openly. Hollis's expression remained carefully composed, though something flickered behind his eyes, an old loyalty and an old grief that had never fully faded. Your Grace, he said slowly, if I may ask, does this concern Master Edmund? Alexander looked up sharply. What do you know, Hollis? The butler hesitated, choosing his words with obvious care. I know only that in the weeks before Master Edmund's death he seemed troubled, Your Grace. He received several letters that agitated him greatly, and burned them himself in this very fireplace, rather than leave them for the post to carry away or a servant to find. I thought little of it at the time. Young men often have their private troubles, but I have wondered, over the years, whether I should have said something. Alexander's hands curled into fists atop the desk. Why did you never tell me this before? He asked, though there was no anger in his voice, only a weary sorrow. Because there was nothing certain to tell, Your Grace, Hollis said. Only an old servant's unease, and I did not wish to add to your grief with mere suspicion. But if you are asking now, and if there is reason to believe Master Edmund's death was not the accident we all believed it to be, then I will tell you everything I remember, and I will help you learn whatever else can be learned. Alexander nodded, grateful beyond words for the old man's quiet loyalty. Begin with Gerald's finances, he said, and find out, if you can, whether anyone in the village or the surrounding estates has seen a stranger asking after a young woman recently, someone who might have been searching for Miss Ashby. Hollis bowed and left to begin his discreet inquiries, and Alexander spent the remainder of the morning in restless thought, pacing between his study and the long gallery where portraits of his ancestors looked down upon him with painted, unknowable expressions. He paused before a portrait of his father, gone 8 years now, and wondered what the old Duke would have made of the tangled danger now threatening his family. By afternoon, Charlotte had recovered enough of her composure to join him for a walk along the frozen lake, the very water where Edmund had drowned 5 years before. She had not wanted to go at first, understanding the pain such a place might hold for him, but Alexander had insisted, some instinct telling him that answers might lie closer to the water than anywhere else. They stood together at the edge of the frozen lake, the ice thick and silent beneath a dusting of fresh snow, the surrounding trees bare and skeletal against the pale winter sky. He loved this place, Alexander said quietly, staring out across the frozen surface. Every summer, from the time he could walk, he would swim here from morning until dusk, until our mother despaired of ever getting him properly dressed for dinner. Charlotte stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. He sounded happy, she said softly. When I knew him, even briefly, he had a warmth about him, a kindness that seemed entirely genuine. He was the better of us, Alexander said, a bitter smile touching his lips. Kinder, warmer, quicker to laugh. I was always the serious one, the one our father groomed for duty and title, while Edmund was allowed to simply be himself. I never resented him for it. I loved him too much for that. But I have wondered, these 5 years, whether I failed him somehow. Whether I was too consumed with my own responsibilities to notice he was troubled, until it was too late to help him. Charlotte reached out and touched his arm gently. You could not have known, she said. Whatever Gerald did, whatever threats or schemes he set in motion, that guilt belongs to him alone. Not to you. Alexander looked down at her, struck again by the quiet strength she carried despite everything she had endured. I keep thinking, he said, that if I had asked more questions 5 years ago, if I had pressed harder when something felt wrong, Edmund might still be alive. And now you have come into my life carrying the very answers I have spent 5 years too afraid to seek, and I find myself grateful and furious in equal measure. Grateful that the truth might finally be within reach, furious that it has taken so long, and cost you so much, to bring it to me. I am not sorry I came here, Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the cold reddening her cheeks. Whatever danger follows, I would rather face it standing beside someone who wants the truth, than continue running from it alone, as I have done for 5 years. Alexander studied her face for a long moment, something warm and unfamiliar stirring beneath the grief and anger that had defined him for so long. You will not be running alone again, he said, not while I have breath in my body to prevent it. They stood together at the edge of the frozen lake as the winter sun began its early descent toward the horizon. Two people bound by grief and secrets and a growing, unspoken understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line at the far side of the water, a man in a dark coat who had followed Charlotte's trail through the snow for the better part of a week, and who now melted back into the shadows of the woods, already composing the message he would send to the man who had hired him. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered not by the usual post but slipped beneath the kitchen door sometime in the night, discovered by a maid when she came down before dawn to light the stoves. There was no signature, only a few lines written in a plain, hurried hand, and when Hollis brought it to the study, Alexander felt the blood drain from his face as he read it. I know where she is. Tell her to remember what she was told 5 years ago, or the next accident will not be so far in the past. Alexander crossed the study in 3 strides and pulled the bell rope, summoning every available footman to the house at once. Charlotte, when she was brought to him and shown the letter, went pale and silent, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the paper. He knows, she whispered. He knows I am here. Alexander took the letter back from her gently and set it on the desk. This changes nothing, he said, though his voice was tighter than he intended. You are still under my protection. I will simply ensure that protection is stronger than it was. That evening, Ashmere Hall transformed. Alexander instructed every door and window on the ground floor to be secured before dark, posted footmen at regular intervals throughout the grounds, and sent word to the local magistrate, a longtime friend of his late father, requesting discreet assistance in watching the roads leading to the estate. He did not yet have proof enough to accuse Gerald openly, but he intended to make certain that whoever Gerald had hired would find no easy opportunity to reach Charlotte again. Despite the precautions, Charlotte barely slept that night, and when Alexander found her the following morning in the small drawing room, dark shadows beneath her eyes, he understood that fear alone was not enough to keep her safe. Something more decisive was needed. "There is a ball at Lady Pennington's estate in 2 days," he said, sitting across from her. "The entire county will attend, including, I suspect, my cousin Gerald, who never misses an opportunity to be seen among society. I want you to attend with me." Charlotte stared at him as though he had lost his senses. "You wish me to appear in public," she said, "when a man has just threatened my life." "I wish for Gerald to see that you are under my protection, publicly and unmistakably," Alexander said. "If he believes you are simply hidden away, vulnerable and alone, he may grow bold enough to try something more direct. But if the entire county sees you at my side, treated with respect and care, he will be forced to reconsider any plan that involves harming you without drawing suspicion directly to himself." Charlotte considered this for a long moment, weighing the risk against the strange, undeniable logic of his plan. "And what am I meant to be, at this ball?" she asked. "Your guest, your charity case, the subject of whatever rumors the county has already invented about me." Alexander hesitated, and something in his expression made Charlotte's breath catch before he even spoke. "My intended," he said quietly. "If you are willing, it would explain your presence here beyond question, and it would place you under a protection that Gerald would think twice before challenging, even in secret." Charlotte's cheeks flushed, though whether from the cold morning air or the suggestion itself, Alexander could not say. "You wish for us to pretend an engagement," she said slowly. "For the ball, yes," Alexander said. "Nothing more than that, unless you wished it to be otherwise." The words hung between them, heavier than either had intended, and for a moment neither seemed to know quite what to do with the sudden, unspoken possibility that had entered the room. Charlotte looked away first, her composure returning by visible effort. "Very well," she said. "If you believe it will help keep us both safe, I will play the part." 2 days later, Ashmere Hall's finest carriage carried them through the snow-dusted roads toward Lady Pennington's grand estate, its windows blazing with candlelight visible from a mile away. Charlotte wore a gown of deep blue silk that Mrs. Ellery had procured on short notice, and though she fidgeted nervously with her gloves throughout the journey, she looked, Alexander thought, entirely at ease with the elegance of a woman born to such gatherings, whatever her circumstances truly were. "You look beautiful," he said as the carriage rolled to a stop before the brightly lit entrance. Charlotte's eyes met his, startled by the simple honesty of the compliment. "Thank you," she said softly. "I confess I have not attended anything so grand in a very long time." "Stay close to me tonight," Alexander said, his voice low and serious once more. "Whatever Gerald does or says, do not let him see you afraid." The ballroom, when they entered, was a glittering swirl of silk and candlelight, the county's finest families gathered in their winter best, and Alexander felt the familiar weight of dozens of curious eyes turning toward them as he led Charlotte through the crowd. Whispers followed in their wake, exactly as he had intended, though he saw Charlotte's spine stiffen slightly at the attention. They danced twice, and though Charlotte's steps were slightly unpracticed from years away from such occasions, there was a natural grace to her that drew admiring glances from more than one gentleman in the room, glances that Alexander found himself disliking with an intensity that surprised him. It was near the third dance that Gerald finally approached, resplendent in a dark green coat, his smile as easy and dangerous as ever. "Cousin," Gerald said, bowing with exaggerated courtesy, "and is this the mysterious guest the whole county has been speaking of? You must introduce us properly at last." Alexander kept his expression carefully neutral, though every instinct in him screamed a warning. "Charlotte," he said, "this is my cousin, Gerald Whitmore. Gerald, may I present Miss Charlotte Ashby, my intended." The word landed exactly as Alexander had hoped, a ripple of surprise passing across Gerald's face before his smile smoothed back into place, though something colder now lingered behind his eyes. "Your intended," Gerald repeated. "How very sudden, cousin. I had no idea matters between you had progressed so far. Love does not always announce itself on a convenient schedule," Alexander said evenly. Gerald turned his attention to Charlotte, his gaze lingering a moment too long. assessing her in a way that made Alexander's jaw tighten. "Miss Ashby," he said, "a pleasure. Tell me, where does your family hail from? I do not believe I have heard the name before." Charlotte held his gaze with a steadiness that Alexander admired, though he could see the effort it cost her. "My family is from Dorset, Your Grace," she said smoothly, "though we have not been in society for some years. My father's fortunes declined when I was young, and I have supported myself as a governess ever since." "How resourceful," Gerald said, his tone pleasant on the surface, though something sharper moved beneath it. "And how fortunate for you to have found such an advantageous position at Ashmere Hall." The insinuation was not subtle, and Alexander felt his temper rise sharply. "Careful, Gerald," he said quietly. Gerald raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, his smile widening. "I meant no offense, cousin. I only marvel at how quickly fortune can change for a young woman in the right circumstances. Miss Ashby, I do hope you will enjoy your evening. The Pennington Ballroom is said to be quite drafty near the terrace doors. One should be careful not to wander too near, especially alone." The warning was thinly veiled, and Charlotte's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Alexander's arm. Gerald offered one final bow and melted back into the crowd, leaving a chill behind him that had nothing to do with the winter air. "He knows," Charlotte whispered once Gerald was out of earshot. "He knows I know something." Alexander guided her toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from curious ears. "He suspects," he said. "That is not the same as knowing. But we must be more careful than ever tonight. Do not leave my side, and do not go near the terrace, whatever excuse might be offered to draw you there." They remained close together for the rest of the evening, and though the ball continued around them in a swirl of music and candlelight, Alexander found his attention constantly drawn back to Charlotte, to the quiet courage with which she navigated a room full of strangers who might, for all she knew, include the very man who had threatened her life. When their eyes met across a lull in conversation, something passed between them that had nothing to do with the danger surrounding them, and everything to do with the strange, undeniable connection that had grown steadily since the night he found her in the snow. It was well past midnight when they finally departed, and as the carriage carried them back toward Ashmere Hall through the dark and silent countryside, Charlotte finally allowed the tension to leave her shoulders, sinking back against the seat with a long, exhausted breath. "You did well tonight," Alexander said, watching her in the dim lantern light. "I was terrified the entire time," Charlotte admitted, a small, tired laugh escaping her. "You did not show it," Alexander said. "Not once." Charlotte turned to look at him, and in the close quiet of the carriage, something in her expression shifted, softened, the fear of the evening giving way to something gentler. "Thank you," she said, "for tonight, for standing beside me in there, in front of everyone, when you had no obligation to do so." "I wanted to," Alexander said simply. The carriage rattled on through the darkness, and neither of them spoke again for the remainder of the journey, though the silence between them had changed entirely from the wary distance of the first days after the storm. It had become something warmer now, charged with unspoken feeling, and when Alexander helped Charlotte down from the carriage before the great doors of Ashmere Hall, his hand lingered on hers a moment longer than propriety strictly required. Whatever Gerald intended, whatever danger still lay ahead, Alexander understood, standing there in the cold moonlight with Charlotte's hand in his, that he was no longer merely protecting a stranger who had stumbled into his life. He was protecting someone who had, in the space of little more than a week, become essential to him in ways he had not allowed himself to feel since long before his brother's death had frozen something inside him. "Good night, Charlotte," he said softly. "Good night, Alexander," she replied, and for the first time, she used his given name, the sound of it settling warm and unfamiliar in the cold night air between them. Inside, Hollis was waiting in the entrance hall, his expression grave despite the late hour. "Your Grace," he said quietly, once Charlotte had retired upstairs, "I have news, though I fear it is not the sort you will welcome gladly." Alexander led him into the study, closing the door firmly behind them. "Tell me," he said. "I made inquiries, as you asked, regarding Mr. Gerald's finances," Hollis said. 5 years ago, in the very month of Master Edmund's death, Mr. Gerald settled a considerable debt, nearly £3,000, to a moneylender in London who has since retired from business and left the country. The payment came suddenly, and no one among his usual acquaintances could account for where the funds had come from, since his estate had been badly encumbered for years before that. £3,000, Alexander repeated, his voice hollow. "There is more," Hollis continued. "I spoke, carefully, with a groundskeeper who once worked at the Pemberton estate near the coast, the very household Miss Ashby described. He remembered Master Edmund's visit 5 years ago, and he remembered, too, a stranger who came asking after Master Edmund's habits in the days before his death, a man matching no description of anyone from this county. The groundskeeper assumed at the time that the stranger was simply curious, but he never forgot the encounter, for the man paid him a full crown merely to answer a few idle questions about swimming and the tides. Alexander sat down heavily in his chair, the weight of 5 years of grief and unanswered questions pressing down on him with sudden, crushing force. He paid someone to learn Edmund's habits, Alexander said slowly, to know when and where he would be vulnerable. It is not proof, Your Grace, Hollis said gently. Not proof enough for a magistrate, not yet. But it is a thread, and a strong one, connecting your cousin's sudden fortune to the very weeks surrounding Master Edmund's death. Alexander pressed his hands against his eyes, exhaustion and fury warring inside him in equal measure. 5 years, he said. 5 years I mourned an accident, while the man responsible sat across from me at family dinners, offered his condolences at the funeral, and has spent every year since circling closer to everything that should have been Edmund's. We will need more than threads before this can be brought into the open, Hollis said. But I will continue looking, Your Grace, quietly and carefully, until we have enough to bring him to true justice, not merely suspicion. Thank you, Hollis, Alexander said, and he meant it with a depth that surprised even himself. You have given me more tonight than 5 years of my own searching ever provided. After Hollis withdrew, Alexander remained alone in the study for a long while, staring at the dying fire, turning over every fragment of the evening in his mind. The threat delivered beneath the kitchen door, Gerald's thinly veiled warning at the ball, the sudden fortune that had rescued his cousin from ruin in the very weeks Edmund had died. Each piece settled into place with a terrible, inevitable logic, and Alexander understood that the danger surrounding Charlotte, and now surrounding himself, was no longer a matter of vague suspicion. It was closing in, deliberate and patient, and he would need to move carefully if he hoped to see justice done, before Gerald found a way to silence the last living witness to what he had done. He rose at last and climbed the stairs, pausing outside the blue room where Charlotte slept, unwilling to disturb her rest but needing, somehow, to know she remained safe behind its door. He stood there a long moment in the darkened corridor, listening to the quiet of the house, before finally continuing on to his own chamber, carrying with him the growing certainty that the coming days would demand more courage from both of them than either had yet been asked to give. The scream came from the garden just after dusk, and Alexander was out of his chair and running before the sound had fully faded. He burst through the side door into the fading light to find Charlotte struggling against a man in a dark coat, his gloved hand clamped over her mouth, dragging her toward the low garden wall where a horse stood waiting in the shadow of the hedgerow. Alexander did not slow his stride. He crossed the frozen ground in seconds and struck the man hard across the shoulders, sending him stumbling away from Charlotte, who fell against the stone wall, gasping for breath. "Run!" Alexander shouted at her, positioning himself between Charlotte and the stranger. The man recovered quickly, pulling a knife from beneath his coat, his face half hidden by a low hat, though Alexander caught a glimpse of hard, unfamiliar features in the dim light. "Stay out of this, Your Grace," the man said, his voice rough. "This does not concern you." "She is under my protection," Alexander said, circling slowly, positioning himself to keep the man's attention away from Charlotte, who had not run as instructed but stood frozen near the wall, watching with wide, terrified eyes. "Whatever Gerald is paying you, it is not enough to face what happens if you touch her again." The man lunged, and Alexander sidestepped, years of hunting and riding lending him a speed his opponent had not anticipated. They grappled briefly near the frozen fountain, and Alexander managed to wrench the knife free, sending it skittering across the icy ground. But the man was strong and desperate, and the fight dragged on in the darkening garden, both of them breathing hard, neither willing to yield. It was Charlotte, finally, who ended it, seizing a heavy garden stone from the border of the path and striking the man across the back of the head with all the strength her fear and fury could summon. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious, and for a long moment the garden was silent except for their ragged breathing and the distant, urgent shouts of the footmen finally arriving from the house. For a moment neither of them moved, the shock of what had just happened settling over the garden like a second layer of frost. The man lay still on the frozen ground, and somewhere beyond the hedgerow the abandoned horse shifted restlessly, its breath rising in pale clouds against the darkening sky. Charlotte's hands were still trembling around the stone she had used, and she stared down at the fallen man as though she could not quite believe what she had done. "Are you hurt?" Alexander asked, pulling Charlotte into his arms without thinking, checking her face and hands for injury in the moonlight. I am well, she said, though her voice shook badly. He grabbed me from behind. I never saw him coming. Alexander held her a moment longer than necessary, relief and fury tangled together inside him in equal measure, before turning to the footman who had finally reached them. Bind him, he ordered, gesturing to the unconscious stranger. And send for the magistrate at once. I want him questioned the moment he wakes, and I want to know exactly who sent him. The man, once revived and bound securely in the cellar beneath Ashmere Hall, proved less loyal to his employer than Gerald had likely hoped. Faced with the certainty of a hanging for attempted abduction, and perhaps for whatever role he had played in matters far worse, he began to talk within the hour, his confession spilling out in a desperate bargain for leniency. Gerald Whitmore hired me 5 years ago, he said, sitting bound in a chair before Alexander, the local magistrate, and a stone-faced Hollis. He paid me to learn the young master's habits, when he swam, where, at what hour. He told me only that he wished to know his cousin's routines, nothing more. I did not know what he intended until it was too late to matter. What happened at the lake? Alexander demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The man's eyes flickered away, unwilling to meet Alexander's gaze. I was not there that evening, he said. I swear it, Your Grace. My part ended once I delivered what I had learned. What happened after, I can only guess, same as any man might guess, knowing what I know now. And Miss Ashby, Alexander pressed. Why threaten her? Why come for her now, after 5 years of silence? Because she was the only one who ever heard anything, the man said. Gerald learned, some months back, that she had resurfaced, working as a governess not far from here. He grew afraid she might finally speak, now that enough years had passed for her courage to return. He sent me to remind her of the old warning, and when that failed to keep her silent, he ordered me to bring her to him, quietly, so that the matter could be settled once and for all. Settled how? Alexander asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. The man said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. By the following morning, the magistrate had gathered enough sworn testimony, between the captured man's confession, Hollis's careful investigation into Gerald's finances, and Charlotte's own account of what she had overheard 5 years earlier, to issue a warrant for Gerald Whitmore's arrest. Alexander rode out himself, unable to bear waiting at home while justice was finally served, and reached Gerald's modest estate just as his cousin was preparing to flee, a carriage already loaded with hastily packed trunks in the courtyard. Going somewhere, Gerald? Alexander called from atop his horse, the magistrate and 2 constables riding close behind him. Gerald froze at the sight of them, his easy charm finally, entirely abandoned, replaced by something desperate and cornered. Alexander, he said, forcing a brittle smile. Whatever you have heard, I am certain there has been some terrible misunderstanding. There is no misunderstanding, Alexander said, dismounting slowly, his eyes never leaving his cousin's face. I know what you did to Edmund. I know you hired a man to learn his habits, and I know you paid a considerable sum in the very weeks following his death, money you have never adequately explained. And I know you sent that same man after Charlotte Ashby, to silence her, just as you silenced her 5 years ago with threats against a frightened 17-year-old girl. Gerald's composure cracked entirely, fear and desperation twisting his features into something Alexander had never seen on his cousin's face before. He was going to disinherit me, Gerald said, his voice rising, cracking with old, buried resentment. Your father favored him, always, and Edmund himself told me he intended to petition for a larger settlement upon his majority, one that would have left almost nothing for the rest of the family. I only meant to frighten him, to make him reconsider. I never intended for it to go as far as it did. You murdered my brother, Alexander said, his voice deadly quiet, and the words seemed to hang in the frozen air between them like something physical. I did not touch him, Gerald said desperately. I swear it. I only paid a man to ensure he swam alone that evening, to arrange a moment when no one would be near enough to help should something happen. I told myself it was only meant to frighten him into caution, that whatever followed was simply misfortune, an accident of timing that I could not have controlled. You engineered the very accident you claim you did not cause, Alexander said. There is no difference, Gerald, not in law, and not in the eyes of anyone with a shred of conscience left in them. The magistrate stepped forward then, formal and grave, and read the warrant aloud, while the constables moved to restrain Gerald, who offered no further resistance, his shoulders sagging with the collapse of 5 years of carefully maintained deception. As he was led toward the waiting carriage that would carry him to await trial, Gerald turned back once more toward Alexander, something almost pleading in his expression. We were family, Alexander, he said. Surely that counts for something. You stopped being my family the day you decided my brother's life was worth less than your comfort, Alexander said, and he turned away before Gerald could offer any further plea, unwilling to grant him even the satisfaction of a final argument. Charlotte was waiting when Alexander returned to Ashmere Hall that evening, pacing the length of the drawing room, unable to settle until she knew the outcome. She rushed to him the moment he entered, searching his face for news. "It is done," Alexander said. "Gerald has been arrested. He confessed enough, in his desperation, to ensure a trial that will almost certainly see him convicted." Charlotte's knees seemed to give slightly, relief crashing over her so suddenly that Alexander caught her by the shoulders to steady her. 5 years, she whispered. 5 years of carrying that fear, and now, finally, it is over. "It is over, because of you," Alexander said, his hands still resting gently on her shoulders, unwilling to let go. "Your courage, in finally speaking the truth, is the reason Edmund will finally have justice, and the reason Gerald will never again threaten anyone else's life to protect his secrets." Charlotte looked up at him, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, though they were tears of relief now, rather than fear. "I was so afraid," she said, "for 5 years, and especially these last weeks, certain that speaking would only bring more danger, more suffering, to everyone around me." "You brought the truth into the light," Alexander said softly, reaching up to brush a tear from her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "That took more courage than most people possess in an entire lifetime." They stood close together in the quiet drawing room, the fire crackling warmly in the hearth, 5 years of grief and fear finally beginning to lift from both their shoulders. Alexander studied her face in the firelight, the exhaustion and relief mingled there, the quiet strength that had carried her through terror most people could scarcely imagine, and he understood, with a certainty that settled warm and unshakable in his chest, that whatever had begun as a rescue from the snow had grown into something he never wanted to lose. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "I did not save you merely to see justice done for Edmund, though I will be forever grateful that you brought me that gift as well. Somewhere in these past weeks, I find that I have come to care for you deeply, more deeply than I believed myself still capable of feeling after everything grief has taken from me." Charlotte's eyes widened, hope and disbelief warring across her features. "Alexander," she began, but he pressed on, unwilling to let the moment pass unspoken. "I do not ask for an answer tonight," he said. "You have endured enough for one evening, and I would not have you feel pressed into anything beyond what your own heart chooses freely. But I wanted you to know, before another day passed, that what I feel for you is not gratitude alone, nor mere protectiveness born of circumstance. It is something far deeper, and it has been growing since the very first night I found you in the snow." Charlotte reached up and laid her hand gently against his cheek, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have felt it too," she whispered, "though I told myself, again and again, that I had no right to hope for such a thing, given everything that stood between us, everything I still had not told you." "You have told me everything now," Alexander said, covering her hand with his own. "There is nothing left standing between us, save whatever choice you wish to make." "Then let me make it now," Charlotte said softly, "and I choose you, Alexander. I choose whatever comes next, together." Alexander drew her close, and for the first time since the night he had carried her frozen and terrified out of the snow, he kissed her, gently at first, then with a depth of feeling 5 years of grief had never entirely extinguished. Later that evening, once the household had settled and the fires had been banked for the night, Mrs. Ellery found Alexander alone in the study, still turning over the events of the day in his mind. She carried a tray of tea, though her true purpose in coming, Alexander suspected, was simply to see for herself that all was well. "I heard the news, Your Grace," she said, setting the tray down carefully. "About Mr. Gerald. The whole household has heard, I think, and there is not a servant among us who is not glad to see justice come for Master Edmund at last, however long delayed." "It took far too long," Alexander said quietly. 5 years, Mrs. Ellery. 5 years I might have spent seeking the truth, had I only pressed harder when something felt wrong." "You could not have known," Mrs. Ellery said gently, echoing the very words Charlotte had offered him days before at the frozen lake. "Grief has a way of convincing us that acceptance is the same as peace, Your Grace. It rarely is. But you have found the truth now, and more than that, I think you have found something else this winter, something this house has been missing since long before Master Edmund's death." Alexander looked up at her, and something in his expression must have confirmed her suspicion, for the old housekeeper smiled, the first truly warm smile he had seen from her in longer than he could remember. "Miss Ashby is a remarkable young woman," Mrs. Ellery said. "I said as much the very first week she was here. though I confess I did not imagine matters would unfold quite so dramatically. The staff have grown fond of her, Your Grace, in the short time she has been among us. There is a kindness in her, despite everything she has endured, that reminds me a great deal of Master Edmund himself." "I have noticed the same thing," Alexander admitted. Mrs. Ellery poured the tea and set a cup before him, though he made no move to drink it, his thoughts still full of the evening's events. "This house has been too quiet for too long, Your Grace," she said. 5 years of mourning is a heavy weight for any family to carry, and I confess I had begun to wonder whether you intended to carry it alone forever, refusing to let joy back through these doors. I am glad to see that is no longer the case." "Nothing is settled yet," Alexander said, though a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth despite himself. "There is still a trial to endure, and Gerald's fate to be decided by the courts, and Charlotte herself has only just begun to imagine a future that does not involve running from danger. Trials end," Mrs. Ellery said simply. "Fear fades, given time and safety enough to heal. And I have watched enough young couples find their way toward each other, over my years in service to this family, to recognize the look that passed between the two of you tonight when you thought no one else was watching. Whatever comes next, Your Grace, I do not think either of you will be facing it alone." After the housekeeper withdrew, Alexander sat a while longer in the quiet study, his brother's portrait watching down from above the mantel with its same easy, permanent smile. He rose finally and crossed the room to stand before it, studying the familiar features one last time before turning away. "Justice is coming for you at last," he said softly, to the empty room and the painted face that could no longer answer him. "I only wish you were here to see it, and to see what your memory has helped bring into my life besides." Outside the drawing-room windows, the last of the winter's snow had begun, at last, to melt beneath a rare and unseasonably warm evening sun, as though the world itself had finally decided that Ashmere Hall's long season of sorrow was drawing, gently and irrevocably, to its close. In the weeks that followed, as the trial date was set and the county buzzed with talk of the scandal that had finally unraveled after 5 long years of silence, Alexander and Charlotte faced each new challenge together, no longer strangers bound by chance and grief, but two people who had chosen, freely and completely, to build whatever came next side by side. The courtroom fell utterly silent as the verdict was read, 6 weeks after Gerald Whitmore's arrest, and Alexander sat with Charlotte's hand gripped tightly in his own, waiting for the words that would finally close the chapter that had haunted 5 years of his life. "Guilty," the foreman said, and the words seemed to echo through the packed room, striking Gerald where he stood pale and diminished in the dock, all his easy charm long since stripped away by weeks of imprisonment and the mounting weight of evidence against him. The judge's sentence followed swiftly, transportation for life, and Gerald was led away without a final word, without even a glance toward the cousin whose family he had shattered. "It is finished," Charlotte whispered, as they stepped out of the courthouse into a bright, unexpected burst of late winter sunshine. "Not finished," Alexander said, drawing her hand through his arm as they descended the courthouse steps together. "Only beginning, I think." The county, once buzzing with suspicious whispers about the mysterious young woman who had appeared at Ashmere Hall in a snowstorm, had transformed entirely in its opinion of Charlotte Ashby over the weeks of the trial. Her testimony, delivered with quiet courage before a room full of strangers, had won her admirers where once there had only been idle gossip, and by the time the verdict was announced, she had become something of a local heroine, the brave young woman whose long-buried testimony had finally brought a murderer to justice. Lady Pennington, whose ball had first introduced Charlotte to society's curious eyes, called upon Ashmere Hall within days of the trial's conclusion, full of warm congratulations and an invitation to a spring gathering that made no mention whatsoever of Charlotte's uncertain origins. Other invitations followed, and where once Charlotte had walked through drawing rooms bracing herself for whispered judgment, she now found herself greeted with genuine warmth and curiosity, her past no longer a source of scandal but of quiet, hard-won respect. Alexander watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction, though his attention, in truth, remained fixed on something far more personal than society's shifting opinions. In the weeks since Gerald's arrest, he and Charlotte had grown steadily closer, their earlier caution giving way to an easy warmth that filled Ashmere Hall with a lightness it had not known in 5 long years. They walked the grounds together each morning, weather permitting, and spent long evenings in the library, Charlotte curled in the same window seat where she had once confessed her first fragile truth to him, now filled with laughter rather than fear. One afternoon, nearly 2 months after the trial's conclusion, Alexander led Charlotte on a walk toward the edge of the estate, toward the very stream where he had first found her collapsed and freezing in the snow. The landscape had transformed entirely since that terrible night, the snow long since melted, the old oak tree now budding with the first green shoots of an early spring, birdsong filling the air where once there had been only silence and cold. "Do you remember this place?" Alexander asked, stopping beneath the oak's spreading branches. Charlotte looked around, recognition slowly dawning in her eyes. "This is where you found me," she said softly. "I barely remember it myself, only fragments, the cold, and then your voice, asking if I could hear you." "I have thought of this spot often," Alexander said. "Since that night, I could not walk past it without remembering how close I came to losing you before I had even properly found you. Another hour in that cold, the physician told me, and matters might have ended very differently." Charlotte reached up and touched his cheek gently, the gesture as natural now as breathing, worlds away from the wary stranger who had once flinched from his questions. "But you did find me," she said, "and everything since has led us here." Alexander took her hand from his cheek and held it between both of his own, his heart pounding with a nervousness that felt strange after everything they had already faced together. "Charlotte," he said, "I have brought you here for a reason beyond simple memory. This place marked the beginning of everything between us, the night fate, or something very like it, brought you into my life when I least expected it and needed it most. I can think of no better place to ask you the question I have been carrying in my heart for weeks now." He lowered himself to one knee in the soft new grass beneath the oak, and Charlotte's breath caught, her free hand rising to cover her mouth as understanding dawned across her face. "Charlotte Ashby," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "you came into my life in the depths of winter, wounded and afraid, carrying a truth that changed everything I believed about my brother's death. But you brought me more than justice for Edmund. You brought warmth back into a house and a heart that had been frozen for far too long. I love you, more completely than I believed myself capable of loving anyone again. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, and of making Ashmere Hall the home it was always meant to be, filled with joy instead of grief?" Tears streamed freely down Charlotte's face as she sank to her knees beside him, unable to wait for him to rise before answering. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with happiness. "Yes, Alexander, 1,000 times yes." He drew her into his arms beneath the budding oak, the same tree that had sheltered her half-frozen form on the worst night of her life, now witness to the beginning of everything good that had followed. Above them, the first birds of spring called out across the estate, and somewhere in the distance, the stream that had nearly claimed Charlotte's life now ran clear and bright with melted snow, rushing eagerly toward whatever lay ahead. In the weeks between the proposal and the wedding itself, Charlotte insisted on one journey before she could fully step into her new life, a visit to her family in Dorset, whom she had not seen in nearly 6 years. Alexander accompanied her, understanding without needing to be told how much courage the visit would require. Charlotte's father, once a man of modest means whose fortunes had declined sharply in her youth, had grown older and grayer than she remembered, and there were tears on both sides when she stepped through the door of the small cottage where she had spent her childhood. "I did not know if I would ever see you again," her father said, holding her at arm's length as though to convince himself she was truly there. "Your letters stopped coming, years ago, and I feared the worst." "I could not write," Charlotte said, guilt catching in her throat. "I was afraid that any word from me might put you in danger, if the man who threatened me ever learned where my family lived." Her father's face crumpled with understanding and old grief. "All those years," he said, "I imagined you had simply forgotten us, or grown ashamed of where you came from. I never imagined you were protecting us." "I could never be ashamed of you," Charlotte said fiercely, embracing him again. "Everything I am, whatever courage I found to finally speak the truth, I learned first in this house, from you and Mother both." Alexander watched the reunion with quiet satisfaction, understanding now more fully than ever the depth of sacrifice Charlotte had made in her silence, not only to protect herself but to shield a family she loved from a danger she had carried alone for 5 long years. When he was introduced properly to Charlotte's parents, her father studied him with careful, searching eyes, the natural wariness of a man uncertain how a duke's intentions toward his daughter might truly run. "You have given her a home, and now a name," her father said finally, after a long conversation in the cottage's small parlor. "But I hope you understand, Your Grace, that what she has given you, in her courage and her truth, is worth far more than any title or fortune you could offer in return." "I understand it completely," Alexander said, "and I promise you, I intend to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of it." The visit lasted 3 days, filled with old stories and old grief finally spoken aloud, and when they departed for Ashmere Hall once more, Charlotte's mother pressed a small, faded locket into her hands, one that had belonged to her own grandmother, insisting she wear it beneath her wedding gown for luck. Charlotte wept the entire carriage ride home, though these were tears of healing rather than sorrow, the last lingering shadow of her 5 years of silence finally lifting from her shoulders. Their wedding took place in early summer, in the small stone chapel on the Ashmere estate, filled with wildflowers instead of the formal arrangements that might once have seemed obligatory for a duke's marriage. Mrs. Ellery wept openly throughout the ceremony, and Hollis, ever composed, allowed himself a rare smile as he watched the young couple exchange their vows before a gathering that included not only the county's finest families, now thoroughly won over by Charlotte's quiet grace, but also the household staff who had come to love her during her months of recovery and courtship at Ashmere Hall. Charlotte's parents sat proudly in the front pew, her father dressed in a fine new coat Alexander had quietly arranged to have made for the occasion, her mother dabbing at her eyes throughout the entire ceremony. When Charlotte walked down the aisle toward Alexander, the faded locket her mother had given her resting warm against her heart beneath the pale silk of her gown, she caught her father's eye and saw there a pride and relief that needed no words to express. 6 years of separation and fear had led, at last, to this single bright morning, and every difficult mile of that journey seemed, in this moment, to have been worth the cost. The vicar spoke of love that endured through trial, of trust rebuilt after long seasons of fear, and though he knew nothing of the true danger that had brought this particular couple together, his words seemed to Alexander to capture perfectly the journey that had led them to this chapel. When he slipped the ring onto Charlotte's finger, his hands were steadier than he expected, though his heart raced with a happiness he had not believed himself capable of feeling again after 5 years of careful, guarded grief. "You may kiss your bride," the vicar said at last, and the small chapel erupted in warm applause as Alexander drew Charlotte close, sealing their vows with a kiss that spoke of everything they had endured together, and everything still waiting ahead of them. As the ceremony concluded and the newly married couple stepped out into the bright June sunshine, Alexander paused for a moment beside the chapel's old stone wall, looking back toward the great house rising beyond the gardens, its windows catching the afternoon light. 5 years of grief had once seemed an unbreakable weight. A permanent shadow settled over Ashmere Hall and everyone within its walls. But standing there now, his new wife's hand held firmly in his own, surrounded by friends and family who had watched an old wound finally begin to heal, Alexander understood that grief, however deep, did not have to be permanent. "I used to believe this house would carry Edmund's absence forever," he said quietly, as Charlotte followed his gaze toward the estate. "Perhaps it always will, in some small way," Charlotte said gently. "But grief and joy are not enemies, Alexander. I think Edmund would be glad to know that something beautiful grew out of the darkest chapter of this family's history. I think he would be glad to see you happy again." Alexander drew her close, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple as the wedding guests began to gather for the celebration awaiting them at the house. "I believe you are right," he said, "and I believe, wherever he is, he already knows." The wedding breakfast that followed filled the great hall of Ashmere Hall with laughter and music, for the first time in longer than most of the household staff could remember. Long tables draped in white linen stretched the length of the hall, laden with food prepared under Mrs. Ellery's careful supervision, and a small ensemble of musicians played lively tunes that drew even the most reserved of the county's gentry onto the dance floor. Lady Pennington, seated near the head table, remarked to anyone who would listen that she had never seen the Duke look so entirely at ease, and that Ashmere Hall itself seemed to glow with a warmth it had lacked for years. Charlotte's father rose partway through the celebration to offer a toast, his voice thick with emotion as he raised his glass toward the couple. "To my daughter," he said, "who found more courage in one winter than most of us find in a lifetime, and to the man who was wise enough to recognize what a treasure he had found crying in the snow. May your home always be filled with as much warmth as this hall holds today." The guests cheered and raised their glasses, and Charlotte, flushed with happiness and the lingering emotion of the day, leaned close to whisper her thanks into her father's ear, before the dancing resumed in earnest. Alexander watched the celebration unfold around him with quiet wonder, remembering the frozen silence that had gripped this same hall only months before, and marveling at how completely one courageous woman had transformed it. They walked together back toward Ashmere Hall, past the gardens now blooming with early summer flowers, past the frozen lake that had thawed into a peaceful, sun-dappled stretch of water, where children from the village had already begun to swim again, laughter carrying across its surface, in a sound that would have delighted Edmund himself. The house that had stood in silent mourning for 5 long years now opened its doors to celebration, its halls filled with music and warmth, and the promise of a future neither Alexander nor Charlotte could have imagined on that first terrible night when fate had brought them together in the snow. That evening, as the celebrations wound down and the last guests departed beneath a sky brilliant with summer stars, Alexander and Charlotte stood together at the window of what had once been the Blue Room, now transformed into their own private sitting room, overlooking the grounds where their story had first begun. "Do you ever think about that night?" Charlotte asked quietly, resting her head against his shoulder. "About how different everything might have been, if you had not heard me crying, if you had ridden past without stopping." "I try not to imagine it," Alexander admitted. "Some nights, I confess, the thought still visits me uninvited, how close we came to never finding each other at all. But I choose instead to be grateful, endlessly grateful, that some fortunate turn of fate placed me on that path at exactly the right moment." Charlotte turned in his arms to face him fully, her eyes bright with love and the quiet peace of a woman who had finally, after 5 long years, found safety and happiness in equal measure. "I used to believe that surviving that night was the greatest fortune I would ever know," she said, "but I was wrong. The greatest fortune was everything that came after, the truth we uncovered together, the danger we faced side by side, and the love that grew from all of it, stronger than anything Gerald's cruelty could ever have destroyed." Alexander kissed her softly, the promise of their new life together settling warm and certain between them. "Whatever comes next," he said, "we will face it as we faced everything before, together." Outside their window, the summer stars shone bright over Ashmere Hall, over the gardens and the lake and the old oak tree where a proposal had once been made beneath budding branches, over a house that had finally, after 5 long years of silent grief, found its way back to joy. The snow that had once brought them together had long since melted into memory, but the warmth it had somehow, impossibly, given rise to would last for the rest of their lives, a duke and his duchess, bound not merely by circumstance or duty, but by a love forged in the depths of winter, and carried, unbroken, into every season that followed. A year after the wedding, Ashmere Hall had changed in ways that went far beyond fresh flowers in the drawing room, and laughter echoing through the halls at unexpected hours. Alexander stood at the window of his study one bright autumn morning, watching Charlotte walk slowly along the garden path below, one hand resting protectively against the gentle curve of her belly, and felt a happiness so complete it still occasionally caught him by surprise. She was nearly 7 months along now, and the physician had assured them both that all signs pointed to a healthy birth come winter, a prospect that filled Alexander with a nervous joy he had never expected to feel again after the losses his family had endured. Mrs. Ellery had already begun preparing the nursery, the same room that had once belonged to Alexander and Edmund as boys, filled now with new furnishings and soft yellow curtains that let in the autumn sunlight. Charlotte looked up and caught him watching from the window, offering a warm smile before beckoning him to join her outside. Alexander set aside the estate papers he had been reviewing and made his way down to the garden, where the last of the season's roses still clung stubbornly to their blooms. "You are meant to be resting," Alexander said, though there was no real reprimand in his voice, only affection. "I have been resting for an hour already," Charlotte said, laughing. "Mrs. Ellery insisted upon it. But a bit of fresh air does me far more good than another hour on the settee, whatever the physician might say." They walked together slowly along the familiar path, past the old oak tree where he had once proposed, its branches now heavy with the golden leaves of autumn rather than the tender green shoots of spring. So much had changed in the 2 years since that terrible winter night when fate had first brought them together, and yet the estate itself seemed to hold every memory close, each season layering new joy over the old grief that had once defined these grounds. "There was news from London yesterday," Alexander said, as they paused beneath the oak's spreading branches. "Gerald has died in the colonies. A fever, according to the report, though the details are scarce." Charlotte was quiet for a moment, considering this. "How do you feel, hearing it?" she asked gently. Alexander considered the question honestly before answering. "Strange," he admitted. "I expected relief, or perhaps satisfaction, given everything he took from us. But mostly I feel only a kind of tired sorrow, for the family we might have been, had his greed and jealousy never poisoned everything between us. Edmund would be 30 years old this year, had he lived. I think of that often." Charlotte reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "He would be proud of you," she said, "of everything you have done to honor his memory, and everything you have built since. This house is no longer defined by his loss, Alexander. It is defined by everything that grew afterward, including the child we are about to welcome into it. Alexander brought her hand to his lips, grateful beyond measure for the woman beside him, whose courage had transformed not only his understanding of the past, but his entire hope for the future. "I have been thinking," he said, "about names, if the physician's guess proves correct and we are blessed with a son." Charlotte's eyes brightened with understanding. "Edmund," she said softly. "You wish to name him Edmund." "If you are willing," Alexander said. "I can think of no better way to honor my brother's memory than to see his name carried forward by a child born of the very love that finally brought his killer to justice." "I would be honored," Charlotte said, tears gathering in her eyes though her smile remained bright. "And if we are blessed with a daughter instead?" Alexander considered this, glancing toward the house where Mrs. Ellery had appeared briefly at an upstairs window, checking, no doubt, on preparations for the coming arrival. "Perhaps Eleanor," he said, "after my mother. She never had the chance to know true happiness in her final years, after losing Edmund. I think she would have loved you dearly, Charlotte, and I think she would be glad to know her name lived on in a house filled with joy again." They continued their walk in comfortable silence, the autumn sun warm on their shoulders, the estate around them humming with the quiet business of harvest season, tenants gathering the last of the year's crops, servants preparing the house for the colder months ahead. It was a far cry from the frozen, grief-stricken silence that had once gripped Ashmere Hall, and Alexander found himself grateful, in ways both large and small, for every ordinary moment of this new life he had built alongside Charlotte. That evening, as they sat together before the fire in what had once been the blue room and was now their private sitting room, Charlotte set aside her needlework and looked thoughtfully toward her husband. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "what might have happened if you had not ridden that particular path through the woods that night? If some other route home had kept you from ever hearing me at all?" Alexander considered the question seriously, as he always did when Charlotte raised it, understanding how much that terrible night still lingered in both their memories, even amid all the happiness that had followed. "I choose not to dwell on it," he said finally. "I believe some paths are simply meant to cross, Charlotte, however unlikely the circumstances that bring them together. Whatever force guided me down that path that night, whether fate or simple chance, I will be grateful for it every day of my life." Charlotte moved to sit beside him, resting her head against his shoulder as the fire crackled warmly before them. "I used to have nightmares," she admitted quietly, "about that night. About what might have happened if you had ridden past without hearing my cries, or if you had chosen not to stop." "Do you still?" Alexander asked, concern coloring his voice. "Rarely now," Charlotte said, a small smile touching her lips. "This house, this life we have built together, has slowly replaced those old fears with something far stronger. I still remember the cold, and the fear, but mostly now I remember what came after. Your voice, asking if I could hear you. The warmth of the fire when I finally woke in the blue room. The moment I realized I could trust you with the truth I had carried alone for so long." Alexander wrapped his arm around her, drawing her closer against his side, one hand resting gently against the curve of her belly where their child grew steadily toward the world. "We built something good out of that terrible night," he said softly. "Something neither of us could have imagined, standing frozen and afraid in that snow-covered garden. Something worth every hardship that led us here," Charlotte agreed. Outside their window, the last light of the autumn day faded slowly into evening, and the grounds of Ashmere Hall settled into peaceful quiet, the same grounds that had once witnessed a young woman's desperate cries for help, transformed now into the setting for an entirely different story, one of healing and hard-won happiness. Somewhere beyond the garden, the frozen lake where Edmund had once loved to swim caught the last golden light of the setting sun, calm and untroubled, a quiet monument to a young man whose memory had finally found its peace. In the weeks that followed, as winter approached once more and Charlotte's time drew nearer, the household busied itself with preparations, and Alexander found himself returning often to that same spot beneath the old oak tree, remembering the young woman he had found there 2 winters before, half frozen and terrified, carrying a secret that would change both their lives forever. He no longer felt the old grief that had once haunted every corner of Ashmere Hall. In its place had grown something sturdier, a quiet gratitude for the strange, difficult path that had led him from 5 years of silent mourning into a life filled with love, purpose, and the promise of a family that would carry his brother's memory forward with joy rather than sorrow. When the snow began to fall again that winter, gentle and unhurried against the windows of Ashmere Hall, Alexander stood beside Charlotte's bed as she brought their son into the world, a healthy boy with his mother's clear gray eyes and, Alexander liked to think, something of his uncle's easy warmth already visible in his small, curious face. They named him Edmund, as promised. And as Alexander held his newborn son for the first time, watching snow fall softly beyond the nursery window, he understood at last that grief and joy could indeed coexist within the same walls, within the same heart, each making room for the other until sorrow gave way, slowly and completely, to peace. Mrs. Ellery was among the first to visit the nursery once mother and child had rested, and she stood for a long while beside the cradle, studying the infant's small face with an expression that mingled joy and old, tender grief. "He has your look about the eyes, Your Grace," she said to Alexander, "though there is something of Master Edmund in his smile already. Or perhaps I only wish to see it there." "Perhaps we all wish to see it," Alexander said, "and I think there is no harm in that. It seems fitting that his memory should live on in a face this happy." Hollis, too, came to pay his respects, standing formally at the nursery door, until Charlotte insisted he come closer to see the child properly. The old butler's composure nearly broke as he looked down at the sleeping infant, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "I served your father, and I served Master Edmund, and I have served you faithfully these many years, Your Grace," he said. "It is a great gift, in the autumn of my own years, to see this house welcome new life again. I only wish Master Edmund could have known what joy would eventually come from the darkest chapter of this family's history." "He knows," Charlotte said softly, from where she lay propped against the pillows, exhausted but radiant. "I believe, in whatever way such things are possible, he knows." News of the birth traveled quickly through the county, and well-wishes arrived by the dozen in the following days. Letters from Lady Pennington and countless other families who had once regarded Charlotte with suspicious curiosity, and now considered her among the most respected women in the region. Charlotte's parents arrived within the week, her father weeping openly at the sight of his first grandchild, her mother immediately taking charge of the nursery with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised children of her own through harder winters than this one. As the family gathered around the cradle on a quiet evening not long after, Alexander found himself once more at the nursery window, watching snow drift softly past the glass, so different now from the terrible storm that had once brought Charlotte into his life, and yet somehow deeply connected to it, another season of snow marking another turning point in their shared story. He thought of that first night often still, the scream in the darkness, the fragile weight of Charlotte in his arms as he carried her toward the house, the single whispered name that had unraveled 5 years of buried grief, and set them both upon this long, difficult, ultimately beautiful path. Whatever storms still lay ahead, in whatever winters were still to come, Alexander understood now that Ashmere Hall would weather them together, its halls no longer haunted by silence and unanswered questions, but filled instead with the steady, unshakable warmth of a family that had fought hard for its happiness and intended to hold on to it, season after season, for the rest of their lives. The story that had begun with a scream in the snow had come, finally, full circle, ending not in tragedy but in the quiet, ordinary miracle of a family made whole again, bound together by courage, truth, and a love strong enough to outlast even the deepest winter.